At 11:32 p.m. on December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 descended toward Miami. Its passengers relaxed after a holiday flight from New York. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, introduced only months earlier, was hailed as one of the safest, most advanced commercial aircraft ever built. Its triple redundant autopilot system, sophisticated cockpit layout, and reputation for reliability fostered a deep sense of confidence among the crew. Nothing about the night suggested that this flight would be any different from thousands of others. Captain Robert Loft, a veteran with more than 3 decades in the cockpit, sat calmly in the left seat, guiding the aircraft through a routine approach. First Officer Albert Stockstill monitored the descent profile, while Second Officer Don Repo managed the aircraft's complex systems from the engineer's panel. Together, they formed a highly experienced team, one that knew the TriStar well and trusted its technology. The lights of Miami shimmered faintly ahead as the aircraft descended toward the airport. Passengers adjusted blankets, chatted softly, or closed their eyes for the final minutes of the flight. The cabin was peaceful, filled with the low hum of engines and the occasional clink of drinkware being gathered by the flight attendants. Then the moment arrived that would shift everything. As the landing gear deployed, only 2 of the 3 green indicator lights illuminated. The nose gear light remained dark. Captain Loft noticed it immediately. He pointed it out with the calm tone of someone who had seen countless minor glitches over the years. Stockstill checked the annunciator panel again. Repo scanned his engineer's gauges. They had felt the gear extension. They had heard it. There was no hydraulic anomaly, no unusual vibration. The nose gear was almost certainly locked in place. But the light, a tiny green bulb the size of a fingertip, refused to confirm it. A missing landing gear indication wasn't an emergency, but it wasn't something they could ignore. Procedure demanded certainty. Without confirmation, they could not land. Loft instructed Stockstill to discontinue the approach. The TriStar climbed gently and leveled off at 2,000 feet, cleared by air traffic control to enter a wide holding pattern over the dark, seemingly infinite Everglades. The passengers felt only a mild, barely noticeable ascent. The L-1011 settled smoothly into the hold. Inside the cockpit, the crew began troubleshooting. The indicator light assembly was removed from its panel, examined under the overhead cockpit light, and swapped with another bulb from the same panel. Small metallic clicks echoed through the cabin as screws turned, components shifted, and the crew worked their way through a simple but necessary diagnostic routine. The aircraft was believed to be on autopilot altitude hold mode, maintaining 2,000 feet with the precision the TriStar was known for. But a nearly imperceptible movement, perhaps a slight push on the control column or an inadvertent mode change, had altered the autopilot's configuration. Instead of holding altitude, the aircraft was now in a pitch-hold mode that allowed slow, unmonitored descent. It was a change so subtle that none of the 3 men noticed it happen. In the cockpit, the problem seemed contained. Repo removed the bulb again, twisting it gently between his fingers, inspecting the faint metallic contacts. He reseated it. Still no light. The possibility of a burned-out bulb grew more likely. Loft asked Repo to enter the avionics bay below the cockpit to visually check whether the nose gear was locked into place. Repo prepared to crawl down into the cramped space. All 3 men were now focused on the landing gear indication system, one minor component in a cockpit filled with hundreds of instruments. While they concentrated on the panel, the aircraft slowly, silently began to sink. The descent rate was shallow, perhaps 150 to 200 feet per minute, so subtle that no one could feel it. The engines maintained their soft, consistent hum. The nose barely dipped. The passengers felt nothing unusual. Outside the windows, however, the difference was remarkable. The horizon shifted ever so slightly. The vast blackness below crept closer, though the darkness made it impossible to perceive visually. Inside, no one was monitoring the primary flight instruments. No one noticed the altimeter's slow but steady movement. The crew's mental model of the situation, the belief that the aircraft was holding altitude, was now disconnected from reality. The cockpit's focus had narrowed to a single point, the dark indicator light. The disconnect between perception and reality grew with every passing second. The Everglades stretched beneath them in total darkness. No city lights, no roads, No visual references. Just miles of swamp and water absorbing every sound, every movement. Passengers remained unaware of the aircraft's gentle descent. Some talked quietly, others flipped through magazines. A few looked out into the void, seeing nothing but black. The cabin lights glowed warmly, insulating everyone from the danger quietly forming beneath them. In the cockpit, Loft leaned back slightly, watching Repo work with the indicator assembly. Stockstill occasionally glanced at the overhead panel. The conversation remained technical, controlled, calm. The crew behaved precisely as they were trained to behave when diagnosing a minor mechanical malfunction. What no one recognized was that the real malfunction at this moment wasn't mechanical, it was human. The principles of cockpit resource management were still in their infancy in 1972. Role distribution was informal. Cross-monitoring responsibilities were loosely defined. The idea that one pilot should guard the aircraft at all times was not yet institutionalized. And so, on Flight 401, three professional aviators found themselves unintentionally converging on one problem, leaving no one to maintain situational awareness. It was not a mistake of skill. It was a mistake of attention, a subtle erosion of focus, swallowed up by routine, confidence, and the perceived safety of automation. As Repo prepared to descend into the avionics bay, Loft and Stockstill continued to troubleshoot the light. The conversation drifted into possibilities. Could the microswitch be stuck? Was the indicator circuit faulty? Was the bulb defective? Should the gear be cycled again? All the while, the altimeter continued its slow, implacable downward movement. 2,000 feet, 1,900, 1,800. No warning sounded. The terrain warning technology of the era was primitive, and at low altitude over flat terrain, it offered no reliable cues. Miami approach control assumed the aircraft remained at assigned altitude. There was no reason to suspect otherwise. The TriStar, still steady, still smooth, slipped lower into the darkness. Inside the cockpit, the glow of instruments illuminated the faces of three men focused on a problem that was no longer the most important one in the room. The real threat was developing silently, quietly, invisibly, in the space between what they believed and what was actually happening. The aircraft continued its shallow descent, unnoticed, unmonitored, unchallenged. And the seconds ticked down. The slow descent continued unnoticed, the altimeter's steady drift hidden beneath layers of distraction. In the cockpit of Flight 401, the crew remained focused on the malfunctioning indicator light, unaware that the aircraft was no longer maintaining its assigned altitude. The Everglades stretched out below them, a black canvas without features, giving no visual cues to warn of the danger forming beneath the TriStar's wings. Don Repo lowered himself into the avionics bay, a cramped and dim compartment beneath the cockpit floor. He carried a flashlight, intending to visually confirm whether the nose gear was properly locked into place. His movement caused a soft metallic thump as the hatch closed behind him. Up above, Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill remained absorbed in the task of diagnosing the faulty light. The atmosphere in the cockpit was procedural, not tense. Loft and Stockstill exchanged short, calm observations. They were performing what they believed to be a necessary check. The aircraft, in their minds, was stable at 2,000 feet. They relied on the automation, and the automation, unknown to them, was no longer performing the task they expected. The aircraft descended through 1,700 feet. Inside the dark avionics bay, Repo tried to angle his flashlight toward the viewing port that could offer a direct look at the nose gear. It was not an easy task. The space was tight, and the angle required flexibility and patience. Above him, the subtle hum of the aircraft blended with the steady rhythm of turbine engines cruising at low power. Up in the cockpit, Stockstill leaned forward and examined the indicator housing again. He twisted the bulb between his fingers. Loft watched him, occasionally glancing toward the overhead panel. Their voices remained casual, methodical, professional, experienced pilots solving a small nuisance. But the nuisance had become an anchor, pulling all three men's attention toward it and away from the instruments that mattered most. The TriStar slipped through 1,500 feet. The autopilot's pitch-hold mode, engaged inadvertently, continued to allow the aircraft to drift downward. No one felt it. No alert sounded. The cockpit was filled with soft electronic hums, gentle airflow, and the low murmur of technical discussion. The threat remained invisible, wrapped in the illusion of control. Air traffic control checked in with Flight 401. A calm voice filled the cockpit speakers, asking the crew about their intentions. Loft replied with equal calm, explaining they were troubleshooting a potential gear indicator malfunction. The exchange was quick and routine. Nothing suggested an emergency. Nothing hinted that the aircraft was hundreds of feet lower than it should be. The descent continued. 1,300 feet. 1,200 feet. Still unnoticed. Loft shifted in his seat, glancing again toward the overhead panel. "Try pushing it in," he said to Stockstill, referring to the light assembly. "Maybe it's misaligned." Stockstill pushed gently. The bulb refused to cooperate. In the avionics bay, Repo maneuvered his flashlight, trying to confirm visually what the indicator wouldn't show. He brought his face closer to the small viewing port. The gear appeared down, but the angle was poor and the lighting insufficient. He repositioned himself, trying to get a more conclusive look. Above him, the cockpit continued its narrow focus workflow. Below them, the Everglades came gradually closer. Flight 401 descended through 1,000 feet. No one knew. The altimeter's needle continued its slow clockwise movement, but without a pilot watching it, it might as well have been invisible. The vertical speed indicator registered the descent, but its information remained unacknowledged, unnoticed. The artificial horizon displayed a subtle nose-down attitude, but there were no eyes on it. Every instrument necessary to avert disaster was functioning perfectly, but none of them were being monitored. Loft, feeling a twinge of uncertainty, adjusted his posture and checked the main panel for a moment. His eyes passed over the altimeter, but perhaps out of expectation, habit, or mental bias, he did not register the aircraft's true altitude. He returned to helping Stockstill troubleshoot the bulb. The TriStar dropped below 900 feet. The night outside remained pitch black, without even the faintest glimmer of city lights. Over the Everglades, such darkness created a deadly trap. No horizon, no ground reference, no visual cue to indicate altitude. Without instruments, the crew was flying blind. Without monitoring, they were flying unaware. Repo's voice floated up from the avionics bay. "I can't see anything yet." Loft acknowledged him, then turned back to Stockstill. "Let's try it again." Stockstill pressed the bulb. Still nothing. The descent deepened. 800 feet. 700 feet. Finally, Stockstill glanced at the main instrument panel again, and this time, something clicked in his mind. "Hey," he said sharply, "we did something to the altitude." Loft snapped his head toward the altimeter. The needle read 800 feet. "What?" Loft said, stunned. "What's happening here?" In an instant, the calm atmosphere shattered. Awareness flooded into the cockpit like a shockwave. Stockstill grabbed the control column and pulled. Loft reacted simultaneously. Their voices rose, urgent now, filled with disbelief. "We're down to 800 feet." The descent was no longer subtle. It was deadly. In the avionics bay, Repo heard the sudden tension in their voices. He began scrambling back up toward the cockpit. "Pull up," Stockstill shouted. The TriStar began to respond, but the seconds were slipping away too quickly. The aircraft's engines roared as the throttle was advanced. The nose began to rise, but the Everglades were already too close. 700 feet, 600 feet, 500 feet. The cockpit was filled with sharp commands and frantic motion. The calm professionalism that had dominated the previous minutes was gone, replaced by urgent, desperate action. The crew fought to recover altitude, to re-establish control, to lift the aircraft away from the swamp rising rapidly to meet them. Repo burst back into the cockpit, grabbing the back of his seat with one hand, trying to pull himself up as the aircraft pitched upward. Stockstill's voice cracked through the cockpit. "We're down to 2,000 feet. No, we're below that. Pull it up." Loft pulled harder. The engines responded with a deep, growing roar. The TriStar's nose lifted, but the aircraft's inertia and the low altitude left almost no margin. The altimeter ticked downward. 400 feet, 300 feet. A faint glow appeared ahead, reflected from the aircraft's landing lights striking water. Loft saw it. Stockstill saw it. They had seconds. "Pull up," Loft yelled. The TriStar's nose came higher, but it was too late. At 11:42 p.m., the aircraft struck the Everglades. The left engine hit first, slicing through the swamp and sending a massive spray of water and debris upward. The fuselage followed, tearing through the dark marsh with catastrophic force. The aircraft broke apart in a violent explosion of metal, mud, and shattered structure. Sections of the cabin sheared away. Wings disintegrated. The forward fuselage crumpled. The TriStar slid, fragmented, across the swamp, scattering wreckage over hundreds of yards. Inside the cabin, chaos erupted. Passengers were thrown against seats, walls, and each other. Some sections of the aircraft remained relatively intact. Others disintegrated instantly. The impact extinguished lights, filled the air with mud and debris, and plunged survivors into cold, waist-deep water. The cockpit shattered. Loft, stockstill, and repo were critically injured. The night that had begun so quietly was now filled with screams, splashing, and the anguished cries of survivors calling out to anyone who could hear them. The vast darkness of the Everglades swallowed the wreckage, and silence returned, broken only by the desperate calls of those still alive. The darkness settled over the wreckage like a curtain, broken only by the faint glimmers of flames flickering from torn metal and the desperate voices of survivors scattered across the swamp. The fuselage lay in pieces, some sections partially submerged, others resting crookedly on patches of mud and tangled vegetation. Cold, murky water filled the shattered cabin sections, rising around disoriented passengers who struggled to understand what had happened. For many, the world had gone from quiet routine to violent chaos in less than a second. Those who remained conscious gasped for breath, coughing up muddy water as they pushed aside debris and broken seat cushions. Some were trapped under twisted metal. Others clung to pieces of wreckage as if they were life rafts. The cries of the injured and the terrified echoed across the marsh, blending with the distant hum of insects and the gentle ripple of disturbed water. The Everglades, though still, were far from silent. In what remained of the forward fuselage, a few survivors began to move, groaning and calling out into the darkness. A flight attendant, badly injured but conscious, unbuckled what was left of her harness and crawled toward voices she could barely hear. Some passengers were already floating in the swamp, propelled away from the wreck by the force of the impact. Others remained strapped to seats now lying sideways or upside down, half submerged in the cold water. Somewhere near the shattered nose section, a passenger shouted, "Is anyone alive? Can anyone hear me?" His voice cracked with desperation. Another responded from a distance, faintly. The darkness distorted direction and distance, making it difficult to locate anyone. Those who could move began helping others, pulling bodies from the water, cutting seatbelts, dragging injured passengers on a floating debris. There was no light except the dim flickers from ruptured wiring and burning insulation, and the survivors had to navigate by instinct. The swamp's muddy floor pulled at their legs with every step, thick and treacherous, while hidden roots and debris cut into their skin. The silence that followed the initial chaos was broken by the moaning of metal cooling in the humid night air. The engines, shattered upon impact, lay partially submerged and silent. The once mighty TriStar had been reduced to pieces scattered across the marsh. Far above, in the control tower in Miami, air traffic controllers had no idea a catastrophic event had occurred. Flight 401 had simply disappeared from radar. Controllers attempted to contact the aircraft, their voices calm at first, then increasingly concerned. Eastern 401 Miami. How do you read? There was no response. Eastern 401, radio check. Still nothing. They notified search and rescue units, suspecting a possible crash, but the vastness of the Everglades made locating the wreck extremely difficult. Back at the crash site, survivors were doing everything they could to stay alive. Some passengers suffered fatal injuries on impact. Others survived only minutes before succumbing to the cold swamp water or their wounds. But many remained conscious and alert, fighting with every ounce of strength to stay above water. The Everglades at night were a harsh environment. Mosquitoes swarmed, the mud sucked at their limbs, and the humid air made breathing difficult. The water was cold enough to trigger early hypothermia. Despite these conditions, acts of courage began to emerge. A flight attendant, her leg broken, crawled across debris to help free a trapped coworker. A passenger, dazed and bleeding from a head wound, used pieces of wreckage to pull two children to safety. Another survivor held the head of an unconscious passenger above water for more than an hour, refusing to let go despite his own injuries. The swamp became an improvised battlefield of survival, illuminated only by small fires and faint moonlight filtered through clouds. Then, in the distance, a faint mechanical sound appeared. Survivors looked up instinctively, though they could see nothing in the darkness. The sound grew louder. Helicopters. Emergency responders had launched an aerial search immediately after losing radar contact with Flight 401, sweeping the Everglades with searchlights. The swamp, previously an impenetrable black, came alive with sudden beams of light cutting through the night. Helicopters hovered low, their rotors pushing water and mud outward in swirling circles. Airboats with powerful lamps joined the rescue effort, moving cautiously across the shallow marsh toward the source of the wreck. The first responders were trained for difficult terrain, but nothing could have prepared them for what they found. As the first rescue team arrived, they were met by the haunting sight of torn aluminum, floating luggage, and dozens of injured survivors calling out from fragmented pieces of fuselage. Many were waist-deep in water, barely clinging to consciousness. Others were trapped beneath debris and needed urgent assistance. Responders moved swiftly, navigating the hazardous terrain with ropes, planks, and flotation devices. They waded through water that sometimes rose to their chests, carrying medical equipment above their heads to keep it dry. The rescuers worked in teams, carefully lifting survivors onto airboats and helicopter baskets. Some survivors were so cold or injured that they could not speak, communicating only through faint nods or hand movements. Medical teams worked on site, stabilizing critical injuries before transport. The swamp's uneven footing made every step a challenge. And yet, under the glow of searchlights and the thunder of helicopter rotors, an extraordinary rescue effort was underway. Back in the shattered cockpit, rescuers found the three flight crew members. Captain Loft was gravely injured and unresponsive. First Officer Stockstill had not survived the impact. Second Officer Repo was still alive but critically injured, drifting in and out of consciousness as rescuers attempted to free him. They worked quickly, knowing every second mattered. One by one, survivors were pulled from the wreckage, their faces pale from shock and exposure. Many clung to rescuers, whispering incoherent words of gratitude or simply crying from relief. The swamp, moments ago a place of terror, now swarmed with organized chaos as dozens of responders converged on the site. Airboats ferried survivors to staging areas where ambulances and helicopters transported them to nearby hospitals. Doctors and nurses prepared for mass casualty procedures, intubations, fracture stabilization, hypothermia treatment, and trauma assessment. Emergency rooms in Miami filled rapidly as survivors arrived in waves. As dawn approached, the extent of the tragedy became clearer. More than half of the 163 people on board had not survived, but the rescue operation had saved dozens who otherwise would have perished in the darkness. Their survival was a testament to the speed and determination of the first responders and the resilience of those who fought through the chaos of the crash. Yet even as medical teams worked through the early morning hours, questions formed rapidly. How could one of the world's most advanced airliners, flown by a highly experienced crew, crash during a routine hold at 2,000 feet? There had been no weather issue, no mechanical failure severe enough to cause a loss of control, no sign of sabotage or structural collapse. The aircraft had simply descended into terrain. Investigators would soon comb through the wreckage, the flight recorders, and every second of cockpit audio to determine how such a preventable tragedy had happened. The answers they uncovered would expose a flaw not in equipment, but in human behavior, a breakdown in cockpit discipline, situational awareness, and teamwork. The crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was not caused by a catastrophic failure of the L-1011. It was caused by something far more subtle, far more dangerous, and far more human. And the investigation was only just beginning. The morning light revealed the full scope of destruction scattered across the Everglades. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived as rescue teams continued their operations. The swamp, once a featureless void in the night, now displayed the twisted remains of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 spread across hundreds of yards. Fuselage sections torn open, seats submerged, engines buried in mud, and floating fragments tangled among sawgrass and broken marsh. The scene was overwhelming, but investigators approached it with the precision of surgeons. They moved through the waist-deep water, marking debris, photographing impact scars, and identifying key structural components. Their task was formidable. Reconstruct the final minutes of Flight 401, determine why the aircraft descended without anyone noticing, and understand how a highly trained crew lost control of a state-of-the-art jetliner. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were recovered early in the operation. Both devices were wet and damaged, but potentially salvageable. Investigators secured them, transported them to a laboratory, and began extracting the data that would reveal the final moments of the flight with chilling clarity. The flight data recorder showed no sign of catastrophic mechanical failure. The engines were functioning normally until impact. The hydraulic systems were intact. Electrical power remained stable. The aircraft was fully controllable. There was no evidence of a structural breakup in flight. Everything suggested that the TriStar had been operating within expected parameters. The altitude trace, however, told the story. A gradual, unmonitored descent from 2,000 feet, continuing steadily until impact. The descent rate was consistent with the autopilot operating in pitch-hold mode. But the question remained, why was it in that mode? To answer that, investigators turned to the cockpit voice recorder. The recording began with routine approach procedures as the crew prepared to land. Then came the moment when the nose gear indicator light failed to illuminate. The recording captured the calm troubleshooting discussions, the removal of the light assembly, and the decision to enter a holding pattern. All of this aligned with established procedures. But then investigators heard something that changed everything. They heard the exact moment when the autopilot mode was inadvertently changed. The sound was subtle, a faint click of the control column being nudged or slightly moved. In that instant, the autopilot shifted from altitude hold mode to pitch hold mode without the crew recognizing it. The aircraft began its slow descent. Because the night outside was pitch black and the weather was clear, there were no external cues to indicate a change in altitude. Inside the cockpit, the crew remained fixated on the landing gear indicator. The next minutes of audio were dominated by conversations focused entirely on the malfunctioning bulb. Voices moved in and out as the crew swapped components, tested connections, and discussed possible causes. Not once during this period did any crew member verbally confirm the aircraft's altitude. This was not negligence. It was human vulnerability disguised as technical proficiency. As investigators listened further, the tension in the recording rose sharply. Stockstill's sudden realization, "We did something to the altitude," was the first indication that the crew finally noticed the descent. Loft's shocked response followed. The cockpit erupted in sudden urgency as they attempted to recover lost altitude. But by then, the aircraft was already too low. The CVR captured the final seconds, the engines spooling up, the crew shouting commands, the sound of impact. These last moments confirmed what investigators suspected. The aircraft had flown into terrain because no one was flying it. With these findings, investigators reconstructed the chain of errors that led to the crash. The first link was the nose gear indicator light, a minor annoyance, not a safety threat. The second was the crew's collective decision to troubleshoot the light instead of delegating tasks and maintaining situational awareness. The third was the autopilot mode change, which went unnoticed. The fourth was the lack of monitoring of essential instruments. And the final link was the delayed recognition of the descent. All these factors pointed to a single, overarching cause: a breakdown in cockpit resource management. At the time of the crash, the principles of crew resource management, CRM, were not yet formally defined. Cockpit hierarchies were steep. The captain was the unquestioned authority, and other crew members often hesitated to speak up or challenge decisions. Tasks were performed sequentially rather than in parallel. Cross-checking was encouraged but not enforced. And the importance of maintaining situational awareness, especially when troubleshooting, had not yet been codified into training doctrine. The Flight 401 cockpit demonstrated these vulnerabilities with devastating clarity. Captain Loft was focused on the gear issue. Stockstill assisted him rather than monitoring the instruments. Repo, assigned to visually confirm the gear position, was physically removed from his station, unable to help supervise the aircraft's performance. With all three crew members occupied, there was no redundancy left in the cockpit. No one to ensure that the aircraft's altitude remained stable. This was not a mechanical failure. It was a human one. Investigators also examined whether the landing gear indicator light itself had malfunctioned due to a design flaw. They found the bulb was indeed burned out or dislodged, but the landing gear had been fully deployed and locked. The aircraft could have landed safely in Miami without issue. The indicator light was the catalyst, but it was not the cause. The NTSB concluded that the probable cause of the accident was the crew's failure to monitor the flight instruments while troubleshooting the landing gear indicator. The aircraft descended unnoticed because the autopilot had been inadvertently disengaged from altitude hold. Contributing factors included inadequate flight deck procedures, poor task delegation, and the lack of clearly defined responsibilities regarding monitoring the aircraft. In essence, the crew did not maintain situational awareness. But the investigation did not stop at identifying error. It sought to prevent recurrence. The crash exposed systemic weaknesses in cockpit communication, workload distribution, and human-machine interaction. The aviation industry could not ignore these findings. A tragedy born from distraction and human factors, rather than mechanical failure, demanded fundamental change. Airlines and regulators began to consider new procedures that would ensure constant monitoring of critical flight parameters, no matter what other distractions were present. Training programs were reevaluated, emphasizing the need for assertiveness, cross-checking, and mutual support. The concept of cockpit teamwork needed to evolve beyond simple cooperation. Out of the wreckage of Flight 401 emerged the early blueprint for what would become the most significant shift in pilot training since the dawn of the jet age. Crew Resource Management. CRM would teach pilots to communicate clearly, challenge assumptions, and maintain roles even under stress. It would redefine the relationship between captain, first officer, and flight engineer, not as a hierarchy, but as a coordinated team. It would enforce the principle that someone must always fly the airplane, regardless of distractions or minor technical issues. The crash also led to improvements in instrument design and automation philosophy. Autopilot systems would be built to provide clearer, more intuitive indications of mode changes. Monitoring duties would be formalized, and the importance of redundancy in mental workload would become central to airline operations. Flight 401's legacy was written not only in the Everglades, but in the policies, procedures, and training materials that would soon be adopted worldwide. The crash was tragic, but it illuminated blind spots in aviation that had long gone unrecognized. As investigators finalized their report, families mourned, survivors healed, and Eastern Airlines grappled with the weight of the disaster. But in conference rooms, training centers, and regulatory agencies, the seeds of a revolution in aviation safety had been planted. What happened in the darkness over the Everglades was a human tragedy. What emerged in the years that followed was a transformation that would save countless lives. And the story was not yet finished. The findings of the investigation sent shockwaves through the aviation world. For decades, safety improvements had focused primarily on mechanical reliability, stronger airframes, better engines, redundant hydraulics, advanced avionics. But Eastern Airlines Flight 401 revealed something far more unsettling. Even the most advanced machines were vulnerable when human focus slipped. The TriStar had flown exactly as designed. The systems had worked. The engines had produced thrust. The hydraulics had held pressure. Every mechanical component had played its part. It was the humans who hadn't. In training facilities across the country, instructors pored over the CVR transcript, highlighting the moments when the crew's attention deviated from the essentials. They studied the altimeter readings, the unnoticed descent, the autopilot's quiet shift into pitch hold mode. These were not failures of skill or knowledge. They were failures of teamwork, prioritization, and vigilance. Every airline, every regulator, every pilot understood the message. The human mind can break a chain of safety faster than any machine. The legacy of Flight 401 cemented the urgency for a new philosophy of flight operations. The industry needed a structured system to address communication, leadership, decision-making, and situational awareness. And so, in the years following the crash, the first formalized crew resource management programs were born. CRM training began modestly, inspired by lessons from both aviation and psychology. At its heart was a simple, revolutionary idea. The cockpit is a team, not a hierarchy. Every crew member has a voice. Every decision is shared. Every pilot must challenge assumptions when safety is at stake, no matter who is in command. The crash of Flight 401 was frequently cited in early CRM materials as the clearest example of what happens when a cockpit fails to communicate effectively, when workload is not distributed, and when fixation eclipses awareness. In classrooms and simulators, pilots practiced scenarios mirroring what had happened on Flight 401, minor malfunctions that demanded attention without compromising control of the aircraft. They learned to assign tasks deliberately. One pilot troubleshoots, one pilot remains responsible for flying, and one maintains big-picture situational awareness. Assertiveness became a skill, not a character trait. Captains were taught to encourage input, to resist tunnel vision, and to understand that leadership meant guiding a coordinated team, not solving every problem personally. The technological implications were equally profound. Autopilot systems were redesigned with clearer indicators, reducing the likelihood of mode confusion. Warning systems evolved to alert pilots whenever altitude changed unintentionally. Ground proximity warning systems, early precursors to today's terrain awareness and warning systems, were enhanced to detect shallow, uncommanded descents. The modern cockpit became not just a place of control, but a place of continuous feedback, reinforcing awareness at every moment. Eastern Airlines, grappling with the tragedy, implemented its own changes. Training protocols were rewritten. Pilots were retrained on monitoring discipline. Communication practices were strengthened. The airline also provided support to survivors and victims' families, acknowledging both the human cost and the lessons learned. It was a long, painful process, but it became part of a broader transformation sweeping the entire industry. The story of Flight 401 also carried a more personal legacy. Survivors shared their accounts in interviews, emphasizing the moments of courage that occurred in the swamp that night. The passengers who helped strangers, the flight attendants who fought through their own injuries to save others, the rescuers who braved the Everglades' treacherous terrain to reach them. Their stories shed light on the human spirit that emerged in the midst of devastation, adding depth to the tragedy's meaning. Some survivors carried physical scars for the rest of their lives. Others bore emotional ones. Many recounted how the crash reshaped their understanding of fragility and resilience. Their testimonies influenced safety advocates, reminding the world that behind every safety improvement lies a story of human loss and survival. In aviation conferences and safety summits, Flight 401 was repeatedly referenced as a turning point. Experts discussed how it marked the beginning of a shift away from error blame culture and toward a deeper understanding of human factors. Because the crew was not negligent, they were human. Their mistake was familiar to every pilot, distraction. But the consequences were catastrophic, making it clear that systems must be designed to protect humans not just from mechanical failure, but from their own cognitive limitations. The tragedy also highlighted the power of complacency in modern cockpits. The more advanced the aircraft, the easier it became to trust automation. Pilots had embraced the TriStar as a marvel of engineering, and it was, but the crash demonstrated that no amount of automation could replace constant vigilance. The new generation of training emphasized that trust in automation must always be balanced by oversight. Machines assist, but humans command. As CRM matured, it expanded beyond the cockpit. Flight attendants, dispatchers, maintenance teams, and managers eventually received CRM-based training. The philosophy recognized that aviation safety is a system, not a cockpit alone. Communication between departments improved. Authority gradients flattened. Error reporting became more open and data-driven. The ripple effects of Flight 401 were global. Countries around the world adopted CRM principles. Airlines integrated them into training programs. Regulators mandated them. Accident rates began to drop, especially those attributed to human error. CRM became one of the most successful safety innovations in aviation history, preventing countless accidents and saving thousands of lives across decades. But even as the industry evolved, the memory of Flight 401 remained vivid. The Everglades crash site became a somber place, visited occasionally by survivors, relatives, and researchers. Over time, nature reclaimed the area, covering the scars of impact with new growth. But the air of quiet reverence remained, an unspoken acknowledgement of the lives lost and the lessons written into aviation history. In quiet moments of reflection, pilots who studied the case often imagined those final minutes in the cockpit, the slow descent unnoticed, the sudden awareness, the frantic pull-up attempt. Many acknowledged that without CRM training, they might have made similar mistakes. Distraction is an enemy that respects no rank, no experience level, no confidence in automation. The crash forced pilots to confront this truth. Years later, the aviation community would look back on the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 not just as a tragedy, but as a defining moment, an inflection point where human factors became a cornerstone of safety. It changed the way pilots think, communicate, and operate. It gave birth to procedures that ensure someone always flies the airplane, even when a small problem demands attention. And it reinforced a timeless principle: a minor distraction can be the first domino in a deadly chain. Today, the legacy of Flight 401 is embedded in every flight deck. It lives in every cross-check, every altitude call-out, every verbal confirmation between pilots. It lives in the CRM training pilots undergo annually. It lives in the safety protocols that govern how crews respond to anomalies. And it lives in the countless moments when pilots catch a mistake, challenge an assumption, or notice an instrument flicker, moments that prevent tragedy. The Everglades no longer bear visible traces of Flight 401, but the skies do. Every safe landing owes something to the lessons learned that night. And as the story closes, the final truth remains clear. Aviation is built not only on engineering, but on human beings, their discipline, their judgment, and their ability to learn from the past. The crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was a devastating reminder of vulnerability, but its legacy became one of strength, transformation, and progress. Every flight today carries a piece of that legacy. Every cockpit follows the principles forged in its aftermath. Every pilot is trained with its lessons in mind. Because in aviation, no story ends with a crash. It ends with the changes made to ensure it never happens again. Every flight has a story, and this one was written in the skies.